Welcome to the Thriving with the Complexity webinar series. I'm Chris Wells, and I'm here today to introduce Kate Arms. Kate is going to talk with us today about all the things you didn't know to ask, what our parents and teachers never told us about giftedness. So during the webinar, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and enter them into the Q&A box, and I'll be monitoring that area. And there's also a chat window if you need to communicate with me or Kate. And although I'm sure that she won't be keeping an eye on it, but I will, and I'll also be placing links and information into that window during the webinar. I think that's all the housekeeping I have in introductions. So here is Kate.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chris. I just want to make sure that I unmuted myself. Yeah. So all the things you didn't know to ask, what our parents and teachers never told us about giftedness. There's a lot more out in the sphere of the public knowledge these days about giftedness than there was when I was a kid, for sure. So that's sort of what I'm going to talk about mostly today. And the idea is to give you a sense of things you might want to be thinking about if you're new to the world of giftedness, things you might not realize are related, and things you might not be looking for. But before I do that, just a little bit about me. I'm a coach. I run a company called Signal Fire Coaching, and our mission is creating cultures where people thrive. And we do that through coaching and training, and particularly with emotional, social, and relationship intelligence skills. And so there's going to be a bit of a focus on the emotional, social, and relationship intelligence skills and issues and challenges that show up for gifted people, but that's not all of what I'm going to talk about today. Why do I care about gifted? My connection to giftedness and twice exceptionality is very personal. As a child, I was given gifted programming plus acceleration as a student. I suffered mental health issues that were a result of poor educational fit and cultures at home that didn't address training in some of the areas that I had emotional, social, and relationship issues that were related to my giftedness. I'm mildly dyslexic. I have 4 kids who are identified as gifted. 2 of them are also on the autism spectrum, and another one of them has an identified learning disability. So I've got gifted without twice exceptionality and twice exceptionality living in my house. And all of my clients are highly intelligent. Whether they identify as gifted, whether they've been identified as gifted, I see their intelligence shining through. People who are not highly intelligent tend not to choose me as a coach. So what was I told about giftedness? This is where I started from. I told you I had gifted programming as a student. In fact, the high school that I went to, the program that I needed to get into, you needed to take an IQ test and meet a minimum threshold to get into it. My parents took me for the testing, basically didn't tell me anything about it. I'm not even sure I knew that an IQ test was an intelligence test. I just knew it was a test I needed to pass to get into the program. And when the results were given to my mom, she reported back to me that I did well enough to get into the program, and that the psychologist had said, you would have scored much higher if you hadn't spent so much time checking your responses. So literally, that is all I knew. And it caused me real problems. I didn't start learning about what's really part of giftedness until I was a parent trying to figure out why my kids were struggling. So I don't want you to leave this knowing that little about giftedness. I hope you already know a little bit more. But what I'm going to cover today is a little bit on definitions, a little bit on characteristics. I'm going to just name some weird things that happen to be more prevalent in the gifted population than in the average general population. And then I'm going to talk about specific challenges that come up. So, what do we mean by gifted? The simple truth is there isn't agreement. It's somewhere in cognitive capacity and intellectual ability, but there are a whole bunch of different definitions of gifted. And I'm just going to give you 4 right now. When I was a kid, the one thing that sort of we knew somewhere around in my high school, we came to the knowledge that Mensa members were geniuses. And Mensa's entry membership criteria is 98th percentile IQ, which is about a 132. Some definitions of gifted are the cutoff points for getting into gifted programming in schools. And schools differ. In my high school, it was a 130 IQ. Schools differ. It can be top 2%, top 5%, top 10%. It varies. The NAGC has a definition that they came out with a few years ago. Gifted individuals are those who demonstrate outstanding levels of aptitude, defined as exceptional ability to reason and learn, or competence, documented performance or achievement in top 10% or rarer in one or more domains. Domains include any structured area of activity with its own symbol system, math, music, language, and or set of sensory motor skills, painting, dance, sports. So that definition is ability to reason, ability to learn, or documented performance, and is not global. It can be in just one area. So IQ is sort of cognitive capacity, doesn't deal with achievement at all. This definition deals with achievement. A very different definition of gifted comes from the Columbus Group. Giftedness is asynchronous development in which advanced cognitive abilities and heightened intensity combine to create inner experiences and awarenesses that are qualitatively different from the norm. This asynchrony increases with higher intellectual capacity. The uniqueness of the gifted renders them particularly vulnerable and requires modification in parenting, teaching, and counseling in order for them to develop optimally. So this is a completely different take on how to look at giftedness, because it's about the internal experience of being gifted. And it includes advanced cognitive abilities and heightened intensity. This is the first time intensity has showed up in one of these definitions. So these definitions capture a lot of the same people, and not all of them capture the same people. So assuming that Mensa, NAGC, and the Columbus Group were the only people who had defined gifted, there's not 100% overlap. And they're capturing different populations. When you look at academic literature on giftedness, the definition section of how people are qualified is really important, because you're looking at different subsets of the general population. So I'm talking about all of these I'm talking about smart people, bright people, with or without challenges that show up in the form of intensities or learning disabilities. But there's something about this bright people that I'm being kind of vague about, and intentionally so. Because of that, and because of the fact that I only have an hour and I'd like to leave room for questions, everything that follows is a wild generalization and a gross oversimplification. So before you flame me, this is my attempt to put out the fires. It is a wild generalization, a gross oversimplification. Really what I'm trying to do is sort of drop some concepts in so that if you haven't already thought about them, they cross your mind. Because honestly, that's what I needed, is I needed these to cross my parents' and teachers' minds. So I'm very selfish here, trying to remedy that gap. The one thing that we do know is that giftedness looks wildly different in different people. And this graphic from Enjoying the Gift of Being Uncommon by Willem Kuipers is just a way of getting at that. We often talk about giftedness as the right side of the bell curve, the end of the bell curve that's the high intelligence piece. And if you just use an IQ test as an example, for instance, an IQ test has a whole bunch of different subtests. And each subtest shows a little bit about how you think, how you process information. And the right-hand image on this shows what if you graphed two of those subtests against each other based on differences of score, and you would just get a scattering of how people process. So everybody processes differently. And if you take that and you combine that with very different areas of interest, various different domains of expertise, in the NAGC definition, one domain is sufficient. Once you've taken your learning into a domain to a level of achievement, you are sort of way off in a unique place of how this way of processing, looking at that domain, comes up with information. So giftedness looks wildly different. Quick overview of some general characteristics that often show up in particularly gifted children here. Quick mastery, needing few repetitions to learn new material and adapting easily to new situations. So adapting easily to new situations may or may not show up because part of what makes a gifted brain gifted is a capacity to deal with complexity and take in a lot of data. And sometimes it takes time to process that. And that can slow down whether one adapts easily to situations, but learns quickly. Craving deep understanding of how and why things work. And then also coming up with their own explanations for things. And there can be creative and unique responses. So explaining things, whether you understand the depth or not. Diving deep into areas of interest, becoming easily bored with routine tasks, early ability to think abstractly, then often striving towards perfection, being self-critical, not being satisfied with your own speed and your products, those show up quite a lot. Ira Glass has a great video on this that I think everybody who works with gifted individuals and is a gifted individual should listen to. It's called The Gap. You can find it on YouTube where people have turned it into videos. But what he's talking about is when you can see what mastery looks like, and then you have to start from where you are to try and get to mastery, you have to close the gap, and living in the gap is uncomfortable. A preference to work independently often shows up. This may be a result of group work not going well in the past, and it may be just a desire to go as fast as you can to a learning destination. Often gifted kids are interested in adult problems, religion, politics, sex, race. They're often concerned with social justice, with right and wrong, good and bad, fairness, making things better. Some other characteristics: stubbornness, strong opinions, not easily convinced of things. There can be a bossiness or a leadership quality depending on whether it's skillfully or not skillfully used, directing activities. Keen sense of humor, emotional sensitivity, aesthetic sensitivity. There can be a non-conforming individualistic approach to life. Sometimes just I am who I am and I gotta be me kind of way. Sometimes in a you tell me I'm weird and I'm gonna just push you away and not engage because I don't like that anymore. The interest in abstract ideas and getting bored with routine can sometimes turn into accepting disorder, not being interested in details. My correcting all my answers on making sure that I had the right answers that slowed me down on the IQ test was because I had been trained to pay attention to the details, because I had, as a younger person, made sloppy mistakes all the time because I wasn't interested in the details, and I was trained by my school to triple check my answers. Questions authority. It is very common for young, bright kids to see through the adults around them when the adults are being more authoritative than they have expertise to judge and back up. Being self-confident with adults, often a sort of sense of, I know this stuff, and expressing themselves well can show up. So those are sort of the typical things that schools are looking for and aware of. There are some weird things that show up around the gifted population. So these are all things that show up more in the gifted population than in the general population. Androgyny. So part of advanced cognitive abilities is increased ability to see nuance and to see how categories don't capture wholeness if we break things up into small categories. And so a sense of it doesn't make sense for there to be extreme gender roles because human beings are human beings shows up more frequently in the gifted population. Weird immune responses. Okay, now these are really, like, I'm not even going to pretend that I understand why. I'm just going to tell you that this happens. Allergies, asthma, and autoimmune issues show up more frequently. Atypical reactions to medication. Benadryl, for instance, is a sedative for most people. I know quite a lot of gifted people, particularly gifted kids, for whom it like ramps up the energy level. Reactive hyperglycemia, so low blood sugar crash. The brain takes a lot of glucose, a lot of sugar. And if you don't have enough food getting into the system frequently enough, particularly with growing kids, you get this, I'm up at peak and then there's a blood sugar crash, and you can get mood swings and upset stomachs because of that. And the mood swing piece can get misdiagnosed as bipolar or as ADHD, when in fact just having enough protein to slow down the blood sugar variability and eating often enough can manage it. Late developing emotional self-regulation, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but it has to do with so much data being in and the cognitive work being done to try and manage that. Often just it's slower to develop to manage that. There is a higher rate of learning disabilities in the gifted population than in the general population. It's about 4% in the general population and about 14% in the gifted population. OCD shows up more often. Also, anxiety and depression are issues that can show up as a result of mismatches. Existential depression and existential anxiety can show up. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And sleep disorders. So just know if you run into any of those things, could be related. Emotional challenges. So I've touched on a couple of these already. Emotional self-regulation issues can happen for two reasons. One is that there's often increased intensity in kids and adults, and so that makes it harder to self-regulate. And then also there can be delay. And there can be negative side effects of having been 7 and not being as well regulated as your average 7-year-old and having been shamed for it. So that can turn into anxiety or depression. Perfectionism, talked a little bit about that. The other thing that can happen is empathy, that social justice, caring about other people, what's fair. That can turn into overwhelm because you take in all of the caring about all of the other people. And that could just be like, you got to learn some boundaries and how to take care of yourself in the face of the fact that the world is full of suffering. Also, it can turn into a chameleon-like changeability. This group of people over here might be more comfortable with this kind of person and this kind of behavior and this set of moods. So I'll be that person in this group to fit in. And over here, it's a different set of expectations. So I'll turn into that person there. And that can lead to a lack of sense of who one is as a person, as opposed to, I just wear these different masks in these different groups. So learning to be a whole self, going through places where there are different expectations, can be a challenge. Cognitive challenges. So this actually has to do with speed of cognitive processing. It's easy to overgeneralize. So seeing a level of abstraction that gets rid of enough nuance to actually deal with things skillfully. Pattern recognition is at the heart of abstract thinking. And so you can get into trouble if you're gifted by thinking you see patterns in random data. Particularly if something's random, but it's a small subset, you can actually sort of make up a pattern that doesn't exist if you have a larger data set. Gifted individuals are used to, because this often was the case in childhood, grasping something new, sort of conceptually, really quickly. And getting a gut level intuitive hit about this is what's going on, this is what makes sense here, and being right. And this can lead to an overestimation of competence in areas that gifted people do not have expertise. It's that quick pattern recognition without the nuance, once again. At the same time, sort of the other side of that is in an area that we know well, and we see all of the complexity of the area that we know well, and we dive deep into it, and we see all the things where we're like, I got a handle on that, and I got a handle on that, but I don't really quite know how those pieces fit in. That can turn into an underestimation of competence in areas where there is expertise. So this can turn into imposter syndrome and a sense of not actually having their act together in areas where they are actually skilled. Also in this sort of same realm, sloppy errors in details when we're focused on the abstraction. When the abstraction is what is interesting and we have to work through the details, that gets tedious. Speed of processing is part of what allows gifted people to manage large quantities of data. And more rapid processing of logical fallacies makes them harder to catch. So if we make logical errors, as gifted people, we are more likely to go a long way down a wrong path before we notice that we made a mistake. And then, if we're trying to protect our egos when we've made this kind of error, we have incredible intellectual capacity that we can bring to bear on rationalizing and justifying and explaining how we are right. So, good and bad. That ability to process a lot of data and abstract and learn quickly is super useful, except for when it takes us down really bad routes. Then there are life design challenges. So there's a lot of challenge if you have capacity, potential, cognitive ability, and you don't have a single obvious place that you're going to direct it. If you don't naturally fit into a sort of a single discipline or a single interest, a single obsession, it can be really hard to figure out what to do with your time, and can be particularly hard to figure out what to do professionally if you're young and immature and you don't know enough about what is going to work. So multi-potentiality, this I could do anything if I set my mind to it, which is amazing, right? When we've got the capacity and we know I could handle research science or engineering or teaching science or music or how do I choose? How do I decide? And we live in a culture that has a huge mythology about find your purpose and just do that. And it's not that obvious for lots of people. So you get the experience of someone who will go to a career counselor, and the career counselor will give them an assessment test and will be like, you can do anything, which is not useful. Honestly, it's not useful because somehow you have to figure out what to do. This can get tied into fear of missing out. To say no to something that is interesting is incredibly challenging. So if you could do music or art or science, and you've only got enough time to be an expert in one, how do you choose and how do you let go of, I'd be really good at playing my instrument if I actually had time to practice, but I'm in the lab. Existential depression is a problem for a substantial portion of gifted individuals. Understanding the randomness that is in the world, understanding that we are people who are so small in the grand scheme of things in the cosmos, can be very overwhelming and can lead to a sense of why am I here? What's the purpose? Why do I bother? Life is hard. And what do we make of it? And one of the cures for that is finding meaningful work. And it can be incredibly difficult for gifted people who suffer from existential depression tendencies to do jobs that don't feel meaningful. It can be really, really problematic, in fact. So finding a way to create a livelihood that feels like what I'm doing matters, and there's a reason that I get up in the morning and go to work, can be particularly important for a certain subset of gifted people. And sort of the flip side of multipotentiality is if you've got one passion and the opportunity to make that real in the world isn't there for one reason or another, that can be a psychological disaster. That can be devastating. And so finding other ways of creating opportunity or using that passion in non-income generating ways becomes absolutely necessary for avoiding depression or anxiety. Relationship challenges. These ones, if you are a parent of a child who doesn't have friends because they're suffering from relationship challenges at school, these are heartbreaking. And they show up in adults as well. They can be lifelong challenges, and learning the skills to manage them is super important. Part of the challenge, I talked about the way that giftedness shows up is different. And when someone goes deep into an area, deep into a domain, that expertise actually isolates them. The number of people, once you've got expertise, the number of people that you can talk to about the things that you're interested in at a level that feels engaging to you, that feels that you're on that edge of talking about it with the level of nuance that you have and the level of understanding that you have and maybe learning something new, the more expertise you get, the fewer people there are that you can talk about it. And if you get to the top of your domain, you are by definition the only person with that level of expertise in that thing. It is isolating. And when we're alone with the things that are meaningful to us, it's super hard. I'm going to skip to sort of the third point on the slide for a moment, though, because status and respect issues show up in relationship here. And when you're talking about your area of interest, and you're sort of at the top and people are below, it's hard to find equalness. It's hard to treat each other as equals. It's actually hard to create a culture that is based on mutual respect, because the people underneath often look up and go, oh, wow, I can never be that. And if you're at the top, you've been put on a pedestal, and you can see that they're not treating you as an equal. And that is lonely. On the other direction, if you see them not understanding what you understand, it's really easy to look down on them figuratively and to not have respect for them. And relationships that don't have respect are problematic and isolating. So if you've got multi-potentiality and lots of different areas of interest, you might need to have lots of different social groups, each of which you get to express a part of you fully. And you might actually need that for your whole life. But to find a place where there's somebody who you can be your whole self with might be really, really challenging. And finding those and creating those relationships where we're not equals in skill, but we see each other as equals in worth, and we celebrate each other's successes, not because we understand them, but because the other person is celebrating. It's hard. A lot of us can't do that. A lot of people can't get there. It's a challenging place of development to get to. And for a lot of us, childhood was not a good training ground for relationship skills. Often, childhood was a place where gifted kids got isolated because they were different, they were weird, they had odd interests, felt isolated because they saw things with more depth and complexity than their classmates did. Often there is a disconnect between the level of competence required to get by in school and the level of competence that feels internally satisfying about I've learned something, and that can cause issues that show up in relationships. I was the kid who made other kids feel bad about themselves because we were graded on a curve and I broke the bell curve. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has had that experience, and that makes for weird friendships and for lack of friendships for a lot of kids. So there's often delayed skill development in relationship because there's delayed practice. If you're not actually in those relationships with your peers on the playground because you've been ostracized and isolated, you're not actually practicing getting better at being in relationship. And there can be a real defendedness. If, as a child, you're isolated, you're told you're weird, you are shamed for being who you are, the chances that you get to adulthood being open and honest and trusting in yourself are reduced. So that can interfere with building good relationships. So this ends up being a big deal. These relationship challenges show up in communities of gifted people who come together because there's someone who thinks the way I do, who's been isolated for their smart brain the way I have, who's got shared experiences with me, which feels great. There's a lot of drama in communities of gifted people, both kids and adults. And it's because all of this stuff overlaps. The stubbornness, the questioning authority, the overestimating our competence in our areas where we don't have expertise, and the underestimating our competence in the areas where we do have expertise. The insistence on fairness, the sense that we know things, the sense that we're right, the sense that our identity comes from being the smart one. Because when we are given that identity and we take it on, then we see ourselves in community with other people who are also smart, and we want to defend ourselves, prove that I'm still the smart one. Kids, of course, have very, very delayed social skills compared to adults. I mean, that's just the nature, right? You start where you are. You start with no social skills, and as you get older and older and older, you get more. So lots of bad habits can form. That just show up. And then you add our intensities. You add the fact that there are so many people who care, people who are sensitive, people who get easily riled up, who have high emotional reactivity to things. So learning to manage all of that is a real skill set. And it's worth just knowing that, because if we know that, then we can approach communities with compassion and giving people the benefit of the doubt and looking for where is the hurt when drama shows up. For communities of adults who are in connection with each other because they're caring about gifted kids, this goes double. Because if we have unresolved stuff in ourselves about our own experiences as a gifted individual and a gifted child, and then we see our kids going through things, then we get doubly triggered because we get triggered on our own past stuff. And we worry doubly about our kids, and then they're like, I'm going to defend my kids. Instinct comes up. So compassion is so powerful. Compassion can be a thing that is a problem and a challenge for smart people, because we have the best self-sabotage. Our self-sabotaging abilities are superior because human beings function two nervous systems, basically, that function independently. It's not quite that simple, but basically we have an operating system that occurs when we feel like we're under stress, that operates from fear, self-protection. It can show up with self-repression or self-denial. And when we feel like we're under threat, we use all of our cognitive capacity. that part of us has access to all of our cognitive capacity, our processing capacity, and comes up with the best explanations for why. Procrastination, defensiveness, perfectionism, anxiety, depression is the perfect and wisest course of action. Our ability to rationalize the way that we hurt ourselves as being things that we do out of care for what is reasonable and acceptable is tremendous. And in fact, a huge portion of the work that I do with clients is actually in the realm of getting them to stop sabotaging themselves so that they can learn the relationship skills that they need to accomplish the goals that they have that are going to satisfy the life design challenges. Because we've got a part of ourselves that is creative and resourceful, and that it's our prefrontal cortex that when that's on our side and we're operating from love and optimism and hope rather than from fear, options become huge because of the cognitive capacity and potential that is why we got the gifted label in the first place. So finding somebody who can see through the self-sabotage of a gifted person and gently and kindly point it out to them and help them find hope and love and optimism is a huge gift. So that's a whole bunch of stuff about giftedness that I, for one, was never told. Some of these emotional, social needs are so important for building lives that work. These relationship challenges are real, and building the emotional maturity to handle the relationship challenges and the relationship skills are huge, both for individual gifted individuals, but also for helping others if we're in a parenting or teaching or mentoring role. And then there's all this weird stuff. There's this autoimmune, asthma, allergies, OCD, reactive hypoglycemia, like finding the nutritional support for these massive energy consuming machines that we carry around in our heads if we're gifted. Huge, like feeding the gifted brain literally matters, not just figuratively. Like figuratively, get the stuff that's interesting in front. Use that interest to drive accomplishment. Use the desire for that accomplishment as a support for the hard work of caring about the details. But also feed the brain. So a whole bunch of stuff that goes along with giftedness that's not just smart and academic achievement. I have not touched on the ways that trauma, poverty, being part of a marginalized community make some of these negative emotional, social, self-sabotage things more likely, that make it often harder to get the feeding the interests and the opportunities in there. Those are massive areas of conversation. So I have rushed through a huge amount of material, and I'm in a place where I could take some questions if there were any questions. Are there any questions, Chris?
There are no questions right now.
Okay, so if anybody has any questions, that drop them in the chat or the Q&A at the moment. While I'm giving you an opportunity to do that, I will bring up this slide, which has some image credits, because I believe in giving credit where credit is due. Chris, someone raised their hand. Can you unraise that? Can you bring them on audio?
One sec.
Yeah, let's see.
I'm not sure if I can.
Okay. Kat said, do you have any advice for helping people handle failure? Oh boy, do I. Handling failure is such an important thing for us. And it can be really hard for gifted people, because often gifted kids don't fail early the way that neurotypical kids fail. So the first thing is to really honor that it sucks to fail, and to really let that feeling of disappointment in oneself be okay. Now, you don't want to wallow in it. There's this balance between noticing it and having that feeling, and then shaming yourself for having that feeling, and making yourself wrong for having that feeling, and telling yourself you're bad. And that's not productive. What is productive is to say, okay, here's this feeling. I'm having this feeling, to let that feeling pass, to know that the feeling is a messenger. And the messenger is, the message from that feeling is, I want to do better next time. And the way that you honor that feeling is by getting curious. What do I want to learn from this experience? What do I want to do differently next time? What do I need to put in place to learn from this and to not make this mistake again? Normalizing failure is huge. Finding role models who failed tremendously is huge. Writers typically tell each other, for instance, about the number of rejections that J.K. Rowling got before Harry Potter picked up a publisher, and Stephen King had a nail that he just put rejection slips on before he sold things. Edison talking about, I know 999 ways not to make a light bulb. Normalizing that actually we learn more from failure than we do from initial successes. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yes, there is
Okay.
another question.
Can you read it to me?
How do you find a therapist who understands giftedness and 2E? I have 4 gifted kids, 3 of whom are 2E, and now realize my husband and I are both 2E.
Okay, so finding a therapist, a coach, anybody that you're working with who understands this stuff is, you're right, absolutely really important. So there are a bunch of people who publish on this stuff, and some of them take clients, most of them do. So noticing who's writing things that you respect is huge. Then there are people who understand this stuff who aren't out there writing about it. And the way to find them is referrals from other people. So if you know other people who are gifted or twice exceptional, and you say, I'm looking for a therapist. I'm looking for a mental health professional. That is really valuable. There are some people who don't know the language of gifted and twice exceptionality and can handle it. And they are a little harder to identify. You're sort of listening for what are they saying about capacity and wholeness versus brokenness. What are they saying about complexity? How much nuance do you hear in what they're saying? Because particularly with twice exceptionality, what you're dealing with is a huge amount of nuance. And then the other thing that I think is really, really powerful is when you're talking about a mental health practitioner or a mental wellness practitioner, a huge portion of what is therapeutic is often simply somebody who can hold a space that you can fill fully, where you feel safe enough to be exploring the complicated parts of yourself. So when you're talking to somebody the first time, actually sort of being willing to share those complexities, the places where the shame comes up that it's hard to talk about, and then listening for, do they feel totally comfortable with that? Because if they feel totally comfortable with that, and you don't feel judged by sharing that this is the challenge that you're dealing with, it will make you feel safe enough to be courageous. And that's what you need in a therapist. It's what I tell my clients they need. You need to do the mental work. Someone who can make you feel safe enough to be courageous and be willing to look. Don't just say, this is the best that I can do right now, and I'm just going to muddle through and make do. Because if you don't feel safe enough to be courageous and don't feel like you trust them enough to open up to them, then it's not going to be valuable use of your money and time. Any other questions?
It looks like that's it.
Okay, so coming up, as Chris mentioned at the beginning, this is part of a Thriving with Complexity webinar series that she and Jen Merrill and I put together. You can register at parentsofTwiceExceptionalKids.com/webinars. Coming up, we've got Chris on the bright side of intensity, how overexcitabilities drive developmental potential. Jen will be talking in August on surviving the teen years without losing your mind, a hugely important topic for a lot of parents. And in September, I will be talking about advocacy for parents of gifted and twice exceptional kids. And advocacy is a place where all those relationship challenges that I was talking about can sometimes prove challenging. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do that effectively. And finally, if you've got questions that you didn't ask, or you leave this webinar and you come back and you're an hour from now or 2 days from now, you're like, oh, I wanted to ask Kate that. I am all over the interwebs. I am Signal Fire Coaching is my coaching company. Thrive with Intensity is kind of my emotional intensity self-regulation brand. So you can find, there's a Facebook group, Thrive with Intensity. There's also a website, thrivewithintensity.com. And Chris and Jen and I moderate a Facebook group, Parents of Gifted and 2E Kids, that is particularly geared at supporting parents. And I'm on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. So I hope this has been helpful.
Thanks so much, Kate. I'm just getting these links into the chat box right now.
All right. So we'll leave the webinar open for a few minutes, so anybody who wants to grab those links can grab those links. For anybody who's watching the replay, those in the chat, it probably isn't accessible. Mostly the way we put the replay up doesn't include the text files, but this slide has all of the contact information. Thanks so much for coming.